Welcome. Good evening. My name is Fahim Shakur, and I'm chairing and host today for Medtalkx and our monthly book club. Batman's back, and so is the book club. I'm so sorry for the actual delay. We've missed a few sessions, but we are back. My colleagues today are Mebs Ahmed. Hello, Mebs.
Hello there.
Zubair Patel.
Hello.
And Mehran Javed.
Hello. Hi, Fahim.
Excellent. So over the course of the next 40 or so minutes, we hope to be discussing the book by Eric Berne, Games People Play. Hope you've all got your book handy. And it's, as it says, the psychology of human relationships, with over 5 million copies that have been sold. So we hope to discuss questions to do with what the book explains, some of the main concepts, a little bit about psychiatrists and why this is an invaluable book, in my opinion, for psychiatrists, the favorite sections of the book, our learning points, and the usual things that we do as part of the book club. As a bit of a summary, if you've ever felt that you've got into a conflict in some sort of a relationship, or you know someone who manufactures their own drama, I'm sure we all know someone of that kind of manufacturing person, then you've probably experienced what games are. And that's what this book is actually about. So it's not really talking about the sort of fun games that we all like to maybe play, the football and cricket and that sort of thing, but perhaps more to do with the mind. And that's what makes this quite interesting. The book talks about a very fascinating, non-Freudian perhaps concept of transactional analysis. And in a few minutes, I'm going to ask Mehran to maybe just delve into that a bit more just for the audience. So we've got a good baseline in which to actually conduct our discussion. This book is actually aimed, if we're fair to say, for clinicians. So to make the ideas more accessible, we are going to try and explain some things in a simpler fashion so that everyone can perhaps understand. But I do think, again, it is aimed at clinicians and they will perhaps benefit most from this book. So Berne, he's obviously studied social interaction and he looked at it at different points and making observations. He made habits. He looked into the beliefs that govern these habits. And in his way of doing this, it allowed his practice to grow. This is not the only book he's read. He's also written other books, so including What to Do After Saying Hello, which is quite an interesting title for another one. I think perhaps for those of us who are perhaps a bit socially awkward, that's an interesting thing to be working at. But he also talks a lot about social circles, small chat, so to speak, dinner party talk, this sort of thing. There's a fair number of stereotypes, which will perhaps touch upon later on in the show, along with certain things that you perhaps expect in the 60s, which may not be exactly as things are now in 2021, but just things to bear in mind. But just because something's written in the 60s doesn't mean that there's nothing at all applicable in this day and age. It's a case of trying to take what's valuable from that time and actually bringing it into the new. So if your need for recognition is like hunger, and if you don't feed it, then what will you do? There'll be many points we're talking about in terms of the ego, which we might have come across before. In order to obviously starve off that starvation, Berne argues that we unconsciously build our days around social interaction. And if you look in a book or a library or a shelf, you see there are many niches of books of this kind. Human relationships, diet books, they all have this place in our hearts and we just thrive on this. It seems as if we haven't really understood this topic, and that's why there's so many books that are actually trying to across this actual cavernous sort of impasse. So while we need social recognition to remain healthy, it's also safe to say that all social interaction happens because we need strokes. And strokes are something that happens as we're a child, whether we're trying to stroke literally a child or stroking our own ego. There's many ways of looking at it. And so I quite like the different passages in the book and how you can actually get a literal or a metaphysical understanding of the book. And I think the book works on many layers. There's a simplistic understanding, and there's also one once you actually put the book to a side and come back to it. We're going to touch up on all those things. I think hopefully that's a bit of a short synopsis. And Mehran, I'd like you just to say a few words at this stage about transactional analysis before we actually delve further into the book. Over to you, Mehran.
Thanks, Fahim. And I can clearly tell that you're going to give this book at least a 4 out of 5, but that kind of introduction. So Eric Berne, I knew about him, and perhaps someone should have offered me that book before applying for psychiatry, because it is actually a really interesting book. As you said, it's aimed for clinicians, but he uses the principles of Freud. So Freud kind of uses the 3 areas: the id, the ego, and the superego, and he kind of expands on the ego meaning the here and now, the behavior, the feelings, and kind of the thoughts of here and now, and how that interpretation takes place. So this is clearly, as you said, about strokes. So you could have a physical stroke or a psychological or a perceptual stroke. So this is where between two people, and you can have three different layers of response. So I think he tries to define it in terms of child, adult, and a parent, and what are healthy forms of communication, what are unhealthy. So how to understand that and how to unpick that moving forward. So it's really effective in primary care psychology. So it's widely used for counseling because the idea is here and now. So what's the current issue? It has its own limitations, and perhaps we'll talk about that in due course. But it's a really interesting book. It's still relevant. I don't think the principles have changed. I think people have built further on since then, and we're talking in the 1950s, 1960s. And he's got lots of interesting YouTube videos where he's actually driving a car and being interviewed about his book, which is quite interesting in itself. So that's why I just wanted to kind of introduce the concept of transactional analysis.
Thank you so much, Mehran. I'm going to jump straight into it. Zubair, give me your initial thoughts on the book, please.
As always, thank you, Fahim, for the introduction. It's a tough book. I think that's the first thing I'd say. It's not a book they can just pick up and read and just be able to get through it in one sitting. It is a book that does require thinking. So that's probably a compliment. The content was amazing, though, I thought, in terms of what he's looking at. I hadn't thought about transactions as he's put them in terms of everyday things that people do all the time. I find that he has it's quite reductive in terms of how he looked at human relationships, and he tried to distill what we do and whether it's in any circumstance in terms of how we use that for our own ends. There's a slight element of cynicism I feel within the book too, where everything there's a motive for. So everything that a person does, there's something underlying what they're doing. I think at times people don't really think, though. That's my only issue with the book, that sometimes you feel as though people just do things reflexively and not really thinking it through. I think he's a bit too kind of the human beings when he says that maybe everything that we do does require a lot of thought, and we've actually thought everything through before we do things. I like it, though. I'd struggle to kind of read it and then just understand it. I kind of had to read it and then look online and try and find other bits of information for others to kind of understand it. And that probably is a reflection that it's a good book in some ways, but also that it's not a book that can be read in and of itself. It does require some further exploring. You get the impression this should have been at least about a 500-page book. It required a lot more sort of developing. I don't know how true his discussions are. I mean, there were times where I thought, actually, I agree with that. So I thought it was good to kind of see. But there were times where I thought, I'm not really sure what he means by that, or whether that's actually quite a legitimate claim to make. It's one of those where I think for him where it's obviously written by a psychiatrist, and we know what they're like. And they obviously think really quite deeply about human relationships. So I trust what he said, because he obviously knows what he's talking about. He's obviously spent a lot more time looking at human relationships than I have done. So I think it was an area where I read and I thought it's actually meant for doctors or clinicians. You obviously got it as a medical student, you said, or as an ST. And I just thought maybe, like Mehran did, that maybe I've just missed a book there on my reading journey along to becoming a medic myself. So I think it was good to kind of be aware of it now. And I probably will be reading it a few more times before I've kind of digested what it actually means. But no, it's well done for suggesting it.
Mehran, what are your initial thoughts on the book? Thanks for the overview of the transactional analysis. What did you make?
I think same with Zubair, to be honest. I thought it was quite difficult initially, and I think over time things start to develop. You started to understand the way he's trying to kind of portray a certain message. So it's very much he'll introduce the concept and then he'll go into the thesis and the antithesis, and then actually delve into how and the more profound detail within that area is actually very much bullet pointed. So it's very much a good reference book, so that you understand patterns of behavior, and it just really highlights things we already know, but perhaps we actually don't. Not me personally, but people in general don't use in practice, about the importance of childhood, the importance of having positive role modeling and the space to develop, because as Freud and Berne also just points out, it's the actions are kind of replayed, aren't they? And the security and how people respond to the world. So it's a really interesting book, and really quite like the front cover, because people will focus on the dice itself, which is the game. It's a game, well, to some extent, game by chance. Some scientists will argue it's not really a scientific game, but people don't really perhaps focus on the what's the foundation, what's the surface that the dice actually is thrown on, and what are the conditions. So it's a really interesting cover, and it's just, as you mentioned about the catchy names previously, I think he really gets the audience right from the front cover itself. So it's it takes time to build up. That's what I'd clearly say about this book.
Well, you've brought us onto the book cover. That's a good place to start. Mebs, I want to draw you into the conversation at this stage. What did you think of the book's cover, and how well does it convey what the book is all about?
I think, I mean, I do agree with Mehran about the cover. The thing that stand out even more than the title are the dices and the pictures on there. So it straight away it does actually sort of give you an idea. It's about games. So yeah, I agree with that. But I think as the book as a whole, I mean, both Zubair and Mehran have mentioned that it is for clinicians on the whole, but also there'll be other people who perhaps, in my view, maybe sort of like actually read this book and find that actually there are lots of different things that they can use as tools from that book to perhaps even may sound cynical, but for manipulation purposes, so I think for me it is very, very difficult read. I wish that we'd gone through this process tonight with Mehran outlining something about transactional, whatever you said.
There's always time
before I even started reading the book, so that would have helped. So I do think that for people like myself who actually reading is something that's just occurred in the last probably 5-7 years. I've never been a reader, so I've just recently taken it up, and from that point of view, I found it very, very difficult to understand.
Zubair, what did you make about this topic, and what did you know about it before you read this book? I think it's fair to say that Berne's prescription for personal growth is familiar. Carl Jung first discussed the human need to realize it, your unique selfhood, and he wasn't the first to suggest we should overcome unhealthy habits as well. Obviously, people have read Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. So if you put it into the self-help book niche, and I think there is an element of that. So, what did you know about that before you came into this book?
I think what you said there about it being in that market of self-help is quite true. The book you could argue could be used by clinicians, and that's probably his primary aim. But actually, if I was in business or in industry or any other area where I wanted to gain advantage over somebody else, I would be reading this book and recommending it to my peers and colleagues, because it quite clearly tries to dissect certain things in terms of how to kind of gain the edge over somebody else. So I think if you want to gain an edge in a competitive industry, whatever that may well be, I think this is definitely a book that you'd want to look at, because it may give you some directives or some pointers. I don't know if that was his aim, but quite clearly, I think given that family people have read the book, I don't think that's just medics. I think I'm pretty sure that'd be others in other industries that have read the book and thought, actually, I've got an idea from this that I could use in my job or in my day role, my day job rather. I think it's an odd one, because it's not something that I'd formalized before. So I hadn't come across the concept, admittedly, prior to reading the book. I hadn't come across the definitions of rituals, etc., in this manner before. Obviously, you've come across other definitions for games previously, but not in the way he's defined them. So to get it at this stage in one's career and life is obviously slightly eye-opening. But in some ways, it's quite obvious what he's saying too. There's a lot of things that he says there that aren't beyond the pale. It's just the way he sort of kind of divulged further into it and sort of dived into different things and kind of said, actually, this is that. So he said aloud what people may well be doing and have maybe got innate intuition about, but maybe don't know how to articulate. But my only concern with his work really is that maybe he just takes it a bit too far and maybe things are a bit too black and white. So sometimes you might say something and think, actually, well, there might be that, but there's no space there for nuance, I find, with his work. So it's either this game or that game or the other game, but there may well be a lot of nuance involved in different people's interactions. So people may flick and sort of move between different areas. So I don't fully, even though I've read it, and I'm not obviously an expert in this field by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't believe that with the first read and sort of life experience, I don't think it's completely something I take on board and just absorb completely. But I think there's something about just being aware of it and taking it further.
Mehran, although you're a psychiatrist, did you learn anything new from this book? Any new nuggets? I'm guessing you came across transactional analysis. I know this had resistance in the academic community, even though in cultural hubris it was talked about quite a lot. But was there any pearls of wisdom that were new to you that you could share with us?
Well, it's the usual critique, isn't it? Different modality, or at least using similar principles, but using it in a slightly different way. And everyone will want to try to argue their view to say that this is better or my view's better. And I thought it was kind of reassuring, to be honest, where majority of his book was about the difficulties and the challenges people can have with social interactions, because his chapter on good games was so limited. Because I don't know if he actually struggled to define what a good game is, but it's clear that if you're going to treat some situations as a game, and who knows whether people approach things as a game, whether consciously or subconsciously, then there's potential conflict or there's potential difficulties that may arise. So it's reassuring in the sense that that's where the focus needs to be, and there's lots of difficulties out there. But it's just that it's nice to actually put some of these principles on paper so you can formalize it, you can put some imagery to the stuff you learn, rather than actually see it out in play in consultation. So it was interesting.
Mebs, the book talks about obviously the types of strokes that we all have in positive or negative social contexts. What did you make of that, and perhaps maybe transposing that into your daily life, negative and positive social context? Did it make you think in a more cerebral way about that, having read the book?
I suppose it makes you perhaps a bit more aware of what you're doing and what you're trying to do with in what sort of whatever approach that you take, whether it's in communicating with people or other behaviour with other people. So I think that it's like, I suppose we do on the whole, we do lots of things without really thinking about it. But this the way he talks about it, it becomes like a process that you become aware of, so that you do then begin to understand why you're behaving in a particular way or why somebody else is behaving in a particular way, and what maybe perhaps you can do. Normally, most people ordinarily we don't think about these things. We just behave and do things over and over again in a certain way, perhaps that produce same results, and then maybe occasionally think about changing things to sort of like look at different outcomes. So this, in some ways, it as far as communication is concerned, says, there are things that you can learn. There are from your, whether it's your childhood, even in your adult life, that you can learn to change and understand.
Okay. Zubair, obviously, this is a book by a psychiatrist, probably one of the most well-known in the media, although fictional, was Fraser Crane from Frasier. I enjoyed watching him, and he brought me more into the world of psychiatry. And obviously, there's been so many now. I think Dr. Cohen, who talks about autism quite a lot, is a very prominent psychiatrist, and I've read his book, 0 Degrees of Empathy. What about yourself, Zubair? Have you come across psychiatrists in the media, either fictional or non-fictional, and have they made you more interested in this field?
I laughed at Frasier because I still watched that before we went off air. But for honest, I'm just thinking about there's obviously fictional psychiatrists that we've all watched on the big screen. But in terms of a book by a psychiatrist, I'm scratching my head to think of one that I recollect. I don't know whether it's a common trait among psychiatrists to actually pen things down, especially a book that goes mainstream. Because you would imagine that the things that they study and the subject matter that they actually divulge into could actually bring bring a lot of interest from a lot of different people, because at the end of the day, whether it's forensic psychiatry or dementia or any other psychiatry, is such an area which affects everybody. Psychiatry can affect anybody from the young to the elderly. So I'm a bit surprised that I've not read many more books by psychiatrists that are more mainstream, driven. Maybe that's one for my hand to remedy. But I think there's something there about his book selling 5 million copies. Quite clearly, there's something there. And the fact that there's such a huge genre of self-help books out there, whether it's weight loss, whether it's just how to get yourself better or think happy or whatever, just you can think of so many books out there that, fit that sort of that theme. I'm just surprised that there haven't been more books that are written by psychiatrists in general or otherwise that are more mainstream, unless there are, but I just don't know about them.
You would have read Chimp Paradox, Steve Peters.
Yes. So you've got him, but that's again more recent, isn't it? So that's 2 books that you can maybe think off the top of your head. But beyond that, I mean, this is obviously in the 50s, 60s, and then we've got him in the last decade maybe or so. But that's like still a 50-year gap with just 2 books. It's not really much, is it, if you think about it? And especially with the developments happening in psychiatry over the past century, there's been so many that have occurred. So you would have imagined there'd be a lot more out there, because it's such a fascinating area. And I think everyone has an interest in psychiatry because at some stage they may want to think about, child rearing, or they might worry about an elderly relative with dementia, or they might worry about somebody going through depression or anxiety or bereavement, or whatever it might be. So there's such a wide array of things that actually could be expanded upon. So I'm just a bit surprised that I've not come across more of these. But I guess that's probably because they're busy.
Well, I'm glad you brought up depression and anxiety, and I want to actually relate that back to COVID-19 pandemic and social media in a way. So obviously this book was written before social media in the 60s, 1964, but with COVID-19 lingering longer than I think many of us expected, there has been a link with that and people experiencing depression and mental health related challenges. And one could suppose that maybe due to lengthy social isolation. Maran, I want to draw you in then. In that context, how would you say the book fits in? Because it does talk a lot about recognition hunger, structure hunger, and then you can fit in isolation. I do want to plug, obviously, we have a social media and mental health YouTube video, which does cover a lot of this already on our Medtalkx channel. But it's specifically with the book, obviously it gives you that sort of relationships, normal hunger for food, but also the other types of hunger. How do you actually marry that all up and maybe relating it back to COVID-19?
So I think COVID-19 affected so many people so quickly with very little preparation. So all the kind of emotional needs, difficulties, networks, everything just came to the fore. So, and this was the kind of point that we actually went on, wasn't it? At this point we were like, let's raise this issue. Let's open the conversation. So it's very difficult, and I think there is certain mileage in people going to social media and expressing their views, but just because you have a view doesn't mean you have to express it via social media. There's also that thing about resilience. There is that danger whether we're pathologizing normality. Life is a very difficult place. Life is suffering. It's very difficult to find, living life without such kind of problems. But at the same time, perhaps that mobilized people to be so engaged and active in addressing the issue itself. So it's a very interesting way of people responding, and I think I found it quite difficult to see where Eric actually sat in those kind of situations. Some will say this is a game, and everything appears to have an ulterior motive. There's what you see there and then, but what is the actual hidden agenda? So it's, I think that's where perhaps people had an unintended agenda. Some people just wanted to express without any ulterior motives. So that's where I found some of the pitfalls in his approach.
Okay.
But I guess you'd argue that he was quite keen on social interaction, wasn't he? So I think you put quite into frame before about if it's sort of like an issue around if you don't feed the human desire for social interaction, you can end up almost starving yourself. So I think that maybe with lockdown especially, that probably was quite a pertinent point that he made there, I think.
Mebs, I want to draw you back in. According to Berne, he said the key to a healthy personality is to bring the adult into steady control. I like that way he looked at it. So basically, as the source of that, you've got the moderate to moderate the impulsive child and often the overbearing parent. Is that something you can relate with either in your life, parent, in any of your roles in society? Because I think that's a really interesting thing that Berne picked out, which for the readers.
I think there'll be quite a lot of people who perhaps can relate to, certainly in the childhood and overbearing parents, or perhaps, sort of like children who were perhaps labeled as rebellious. I think that's sort of like a generational thing. Every generation sort of like kind of tends to say that they go through that sort of stuff. So I think that 60s, but it goes on today in a slightly different way. You just early on, Zubair talked about social interaction and the importance. And when I suppose Berne wrote his book in the 60s, social interaction was completely different. The social media side of it didn't exist to the extent that it does now. So for me, I think that has an impact in itself. Whereas, sort of like if you were growing up in the 60s, 70s, and maybe even the early 80s, interaction was very much physical. You sort of like meals were around the table. You were talking to people. You're not just your parents, but even grandparents are there. So that there was a completely different family unit that I suppose used the interaction in those days. Completely different to what it is today. Very difficult to get certainly young children or children to sit around the table. They're usually on their iPads, tablets, game box or whatever, but they socialize in a completely different way. And I think that, just going back to your previous question about COVID to Mehran as well, I think that it's both, the social media has been very negative as well. That brought people together because they couldn't physically meet. So there was certainly still that interaction with people. Just going back to your question to me directly, I mean, one of my outlets was playing football as a child, and with my parents, they had a completely different outlook on on sports generally, because of sort of like the hard life that they'd led and what they were used to. They you know, for a very long time, particularly my father, it was, well, you know, you're in this country where there are opportunities for you to learn, and I want to make sure that you are educated to a standard where you can make something of yourself. So playing, in his kind of words, silly games aren't going to do you any good. So, you know, that, and some people might say, well, he was overbearing as a child. I thought that as well. But it's only when you sort of like grow up and you begin to understand, you know, what they went through, that you begin to understand actually, you know, what they wanted for you and why they wanted it for you. But that's life, isn't it? That's how you grow up and you learn.
Yeah, excellent points. Zubair, I want to come to you about the point about rituals. Rituals are important, and the book talks a lot about rituals, whether formal or informal. It could be argued that we've reduced our number of formal rituals in daily life at the moment. But what do you find? Do you find them helpful as part of daily life? And did you find the book gave more understanding of rituals?
I think the definition of ritual, I think, was obviously different to what I'm used to, because quite clearly we'd probably think about rituals more in terms of a formal process that you have to engage in for something that is in a more formal setting, whether it's at work or elsewhere. But I think the way he used it was interesting because he made social interaction, and he really broke it down into different rituals. You have a ritual for somebody who lives next door, to a stranger in the street, to a work colleague. And the fact that you had to engage in so many ritual interactions with different people depending on how close you were to them or your relationship that you were trying to foster. I think it's obviously, you know, hit a point there in terms of there is a level of discourse that you have to engage in with different people that is acceptable. So me and you may interact in a particular way which will be acceptable, and discuss certain things which would be acceptable for both me and yourself, but maybe for the same conversation with somebody else would be very offensive to them, for very legitimate reasons. Again, stating the obvious, I would say, in some ways, but also he's sort of saying it though. He's saying something that's quite obvious, but maybe people haven't thought about it as being obvious. But then giving you the opportunity to reflect on it and actually think, well, actually, should I be spending more time with the stranger or with a neighbor, and should I maybe think about how I interact with others? Obviously, rituals in other spheres of our life obviously do help, whether it's whether it's things with regards to work or to prayer or other aspects, because it do give a structure in our daily routine. But I guess I don't think that's the definition he meant though with his rituals here. I think he had quite a different set of definitions here that he kind of brought to the fore.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think he talks about rituals as a series of events which aren't randomly chosen. These are already kind of determined, aren't they? Programmed. So it's almost as though the transaction is the unit of activity, and a ritual is just a combination of those units. From that, I got that every transaction, there's an opportunity to make something better, either yourself or the situation. So that's where, I think he talks about static, dynamic, ritual, etc. But it's the opportunity for whether it's the patient or the therapist to actually say, if you modify your response, what's the outcome and how do you deal with that? So it's very much, that's how I felt that he wanted perhaps the ritual to be actually seen, and perhaps how we should break away from some of these programmed activities.
I'm glad you talked about programmed activities. That's something I want to touch upon. Mebs. So programmed activities, I guess, in our society, the Western handshake is a long-standing greeting, passed down thousands of years. COVID-19 has changed that. Unless you want to be going the wrong way, we've had to change the way we greet other people, and perhaps some people have taken to that in different ways. And our genes determine the traits that we express, but there's also an interaction programming its content. So in the way that maybe a dinner conversation is different in Bangladesh compared to a dinner conversation in in America due to cultural differences. And I think cultural differences are quite important in the time we live in at the moment. What did you make of that point, Mebs, in the book in terms of social greetings and structure in this sense and programming and how it's changed?
If I can remember reading it, to be honest, that's the first thing I'd say. Whether I understood it in that sense, and to be honest, I didn't. But I suppose I can comment generally. Greetings to a large extent, such like I suppose overall for me have remained the same, even in different cultures. Putting aside the recent COVID aspect of it, there's physical contact. So certainly Eastern cultures, Western cultures, there is physical contact as far as greetings are concerned, and I think that the greetings are a signal, I suppose, of how you perceive the other person. Whether you're warm to them, the greeting will be totally different to if you actually don't like the person, for example. You may hug, but in a way you're pulling away as well at the same time. Handshakes are very limp if you so there's all sorts of things. And it's the same even in today's society, sort of like Western society. People talk about, well, you go for an interview, make sure you make eye contact, your handshake is firm, and all that sort of stuff. And that again, is another form of greeting initially as well, isn't it? So I suppose how you greet a person tells a lot about yourself and perhaps the other person as well.
Okay, coming near to the end, but the book is called Games People Play. So let's dive into games right now. Okay, so Zubair, I think you're a good one to start with this. I mean, he does talk about games and how we inherit them, perhaps from our grandparents or even up to 100 years back and so on. What do you think influences people in how they do games? Obviously, there's formal rules and behaviors that actually determine the game, and penalties if it goes wrong and so on. And he does put a negative spin, I think, in terms of games, in that they can be dishonest and basically show some sort of level of discomfort involved in them. What's your nature of mind games?
God. I think obviously there's the definite, again, back to the basics again, games we just think about football or cricket or any of the sport that we normally would think as being a game, or drafts, for example. But the way, again, he's defined it is human interactions being play. I think there's a element of poetry to that, in terms of we're just playing games all the time, and everything is just a play on words, a play on interactions. There is no seriousness to life in some ways, you could argue. But on the other hand, obviously, the rules of the game are that you're trying to gain the edge. So you can do what you need to do to gain the edge. And that's the distinct impression I think that he gives. I can't find altruism here in his work. I find it more to be Machiavellian, if I can say that, because you read the book because you want to kind of think about how you can gain an edge, whether it's over your patient, maybe a colleague at work, a business rival, as opposed to improving your own self. I think his aim was probably to do that, to kind of improve the way you look at interactions and improve your consultations, etc. But I think that it's a classic example for me of writing a book with a particular purpose in mind, then having it shifted because of the way your readers perceive the book. That's one side. I think for me, the whole process of playing games in terms of real life, obviously there are some that excel and thrive off it, and I think others maybe not so much. I think that's fair to say. I think for some people, every interaction is a combat, a game to be played. And I think for others, it's maybe a bit of both. There are times when maybe it's appropriate to kind of think about how you're going to make the situation work better for you or for the team or for the patient even. And there's times when actually you don't need that. You just need to kind of just have an interaction with somebody that maybe hasn't got any sinister ulterior motive to it anyway, but maybe altruistic. But I think that's my issue with it. I think if the gameplay was more balanced in terms of how it's being portrayed by him, I think I'd probably agree more with him. But I think because at times the impression I'm getting from him is that you're doing things because you're trying to win, or every single game that he kind of relayed, there was an element where it was just, well, you'll win, they win, mutually beneficial, relationships don't seem to exist in this book. I could be wrong, but I don't get that impression when you read it. But like I said, I think some would really love this book. I think they really thrive off it. And I think it's also, I think, important when you read the book too. I think if you read the book early on in life, when maybe you're more competitive, especially as in your formative years, and they're trying to think about where you want to go in life, I think this book is quite handy. Maybe a bit dangerous, but quite handy. I think later on in life, when you maybe just trying to wind down a bit, or maybe you've kind of got to a stage where you just want to cruise through things, it probably has its role, but you're probably not going to take to it as strongly as you would do maybe when you're like 17 or 18.
Are you at that point, Zubair?
You don't have to answer that, Zubair. Okay. Obviously, as a psychiatrist, the concept of disrupted exchange was quite interesting. If you can just tell the listeners and the viewers a bit about that, because obviously that's when, obviously you've got this model, as you said, the parent, adult, child, and then if that's not mixing in the right way, adult, adult, child, child, but if you're moving around anger, fear, annoyance, many different reasons, is that something you found interesting learning in this book, how we can move from one sort of parallel exchange to a different form of exchange, which isn't what it should be?
Yeah, I think it kind of complicates it with these two columns with lines going everywhere, and one it's unilateral or multilateral and multivariate and all those things. I think that kind of confuses things a little bit. I think he just basically encourages people to be an adult, doesn't he? And assumes everyone has the capacity to reach that, and perhaps people do have a reasonably good capacity. Who knows? But I started to get lost a little bit at this point. So I think the complexity, perhaps he went too visual. I thought and the way he portrayed it through words was something that I was able to understand and gauge. But no, I thought he was a bit too much on the way to approach the multiple dimensions there. But coming back to games, though, I think everyone can kind of relate, especially the marital games, life games. It's really interesting how he talked about alcoholics, and it gives you some degree of realism, but at the same time there is that degree of compassion that comes through his writing. But yeah, I think the life games and marital games were certainly something that got me interested.
Yeah, I mean, as a critique of the book, I think we no longer pathologize unhappy wives or LGBT community in the way he describes that, and you can see why some things in the 60s and perhaps to some degree in the psychology and psychiatric community, there's been some sexist sort of beliefs which have changed over time, and so I think that needs to be borne in mind. And obviously some of the games are antiquated as well, and they need to be made relevant. I think I would say that as a final point on the actual book. Well, we've gone through about 45 minutes quite quickly, haven't we? Considering I thought it was going to be 10 minutes at the beginning, but I think that's gone quite well. I do want to finish by saying that one of my favorite quotes was, "Stimulus hunger has the same relationship to survival of the human organism as food hunger," and the author is very well referenced in this chapter. So if you read, he's a notable sort of theorists and ethicists like Kierkegaard are mentioned quite liberally in the book, which gives it that added gravitas as well. So I really liked it. In time-honored fashion, marks out of 5, starting from right to left. Mebs, your mark out of 5? 3, I think you said. Yeah, your sound was off. Was it 3 you said?
3, yes.
3, okay. I'm glad that's a bit different to what you said off here, but that's okay. I won't pull you up on that. Zubair, what did you give this out of 5?
I'm going to give it 2.5.
Okay, 2.5, right in the middle. Behran, what do you give this out of 5?
I started with 4. I'm going to stick with 4.
Okay. Yeah, I started with 3, and I'm going to go to 3.5 because it's one of those books when you keep coming back to it, there's more and more things you learn. I mean, I was asked by my trainer to read this book. I know a lot of GP training programs and training program directors actually emphasize this book, and I'm sure Mehran, your colleagues and so on, have maybe advised to read this book. So it's common in literary circles, popular in the medical fraternity. I did mention at the beginning about Dale Carnegie, obviously preceding him with some of the things, and then actually there's some people who've succeeded him in terms like Gary Chapman, the 5 Love Languages. You can see the parallels with that, and they've probably taken, I'm not saying they took it from the book, but I can see things in that book and in terms of relationships and self-help. So that was great. Thank you all for your time. I do want to finish by giving Mebs an opportunity to speak about next book, which I believe is a book written by you, Mebs.
Thank you very much, Fahim. Yes, the book is called PC Mebs, Finding Myself. It's an autobiography, so it's all about me and my life. It's about an incredibly shy boy and young man. Due to his sort of like timid personality, he struggles with life's basics. He develops a fear of making mistakes, fear of people and authority, so much so that he completely flops at school and struggles with several jobs. He starts to daydream, which becomes his form of escapism. He then discovers the beautiful game. When playing football, he finds freedom to express himself in a way that he is unable to do in all other areas of his life. One day, whilst working, a chance meeting with a total stranger changes his life forever. He meets a woman that begins his transformation. With her devotion and many years of dedication, he goes from someone who is unable to speak for himself to becoming a voice for those who do not have a voice. He faces many new challenges, especially as a police officer. The pull of 2 very different cultures, racism, perceptions of the police, but most of all, his own personality that for so long was an unbreakable chain around his ankles. He overcomes all these and many others to become a person who aspires for his life to be of service to others. It is a feel-good book that is both uplifting and inspiring. That, of course, is my view. You will have to read it for yourself for your views.
You kept us left wanting some more. Whet the appetite there. I like it. Good technique, Mebs. I'm looking forward to our copy as well, so we can hopefully review the book on here as well. Thank you so much, Mebs, for taking your time on a Sunday night to go through. I know it was a difficult book, but I really enjoyed listening to your insights as well. I really enjoyed seeing how your mind works as well and listening to it as well tonight. And Mehran, obviously, that was great. Thank you all so much and a very good evening.
Thank you.